Today, I am thrilled to welcome Bobby Domenick to the show. We'll learn from Bobby about specifically how Pennsylvania is different from other markets in the US and the East Coast. So excited to kind of take a deep dive into this really promising market. We'll also learn why Italian wineries, especially small ones, need to be as reachable as possible so that potential customers can connect with them. And then we'll learn about the importance of staying educated and continually tasting wine and having fun with wine and even visiting Italy. So let's dive in, Bobby.
Welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market with me, Barbara Fitzgerald. In this show, we'll break down the complexities of selling wine in the US by discussing the relevant issues of today with experts from around the globe. Each episode serves up 3 key insights to help elevate your winery's presence in the US market. So grab a pen and paper and let's pave the way for your success in the US.
Hello and welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Bobby Domenick to the show. Bobby has a BS in hospitality management from Walnut Hill College in Philadelphia, and he spent the last 14 years with Vetri in an award-winning fine dining restaurant in Philadelphia as sommelier, buyer, and now wine director. He was also the Pennsylvania State Sales Manager for F. Magnotta Imports from 2015 to 2018. And in 2019, he was certified as an Italian wine ambassador with Vinitaly International. So it's always exciting to have a fellow ambassador here with us. So welcome, Bobby. Yeah, great to have you here.
All right. Thanks so much, Barbara. I'm thrilled to be on the Italian Wine Podcast. I guess a little bit about myself. I've been working in hospitality since 2008. I got into wine in general, working in fine dining, working on the floor in fine dining, and working in Italian restaurants is what introduced me to Italian wine. Working for Mark Vetri and the Vetri Restaurant Group in Philadelphia really is what exposed me to, Barolo, Brunello, Franciacorta, high-end Italian wine. And I was quickly hooked. And even before any formal training, there was a floor somm position that I was offered at another restaurant called Osteria in 2010. And, I memorized the list. I read some Italian wine books, Italiano, Wine Bible. And, I just quickly started tasting wine and being exposed to tasting, buying, staff trainings and all that fun stuff that is sort of led me on the path to where I'm at today.
That's fantastic. But I think it's fair to say there was some bug that really bit you as soon as you took on this new role, were reading all of these kind of in-depth books about Italian wine and memorizing did you say it was 200 wines on the list that you memorized?
There was probably like 200 wines on the list at Osteria. And before that, I was like, hosting, serving, doing whatever at Vetri. And so we were talking always about Italian wine, Dolcetto, Sangiovese, pronunciations, the importance, where the grapes come from. So I had like a 6-month preview of Italian wine. And then, when I was trying to sell wine on the floor, I had like, a back pocket of like maybe 20 or 30 wines that I've tasted in OL. So I was like, at least I can recommend these on this page. As long as I knew 1 or 2 on a page, I could like get around working the floor. And that seemed to work for the first few months that I was somming on the floor.
Nice. So a little on-the-job training.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's always what everybody's doing, right?
Awesome. Well, in this episode, we'll learn from Bobby about specifically how Pennsylvania is different from other markets in the US and the East Coast. So excited to kind of take a deep dive into this really promising market. We'll also learn why Italian wineries, especially small ones, need to be as reachable as possible so that potential customers can connect with them. And then we'll learn about the importance of staying educated and continually tasting wine and having fun with wine and even visiting Italy. So let's dive in, Bobby.
Okay.
First, I'd love to talk about Pennsylvania. As we said, lots of promise in the secondary market. So let's talk about some of those opportunities. What are some of like the typical consumer demographics in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I mean, Pennsylvania, it's a pretty big state, but it often gets overlooked by the New York market being right, an hour and a half Amtrak ride from Philly to Manhattan. So a lot of producers might not even think about distribution in PA. But, there's two big cities, Philadelphia on the east side and Pittsburgh on the west side. And I think they're both pretty strong markets. I mean, Philadelphia is more of an established market. A lot of universities here, University of Penn's here. There's a lot of hospitals, doctors, some business, less finance, but it's a pretty big city that I think attracts, people from all over. And Pittsburgh may be less visited. To get to Pittsburgh from Philadelphia, it's not easy to get to. There's no fast train. It's a 5 or 6 hour car ride. The flights don't make sense. So it feels more like a Midwest city, but it's still a market worth considering. Like when I was selling wine in Pennsylvania, I had to dedicate days every month to get out to Pittsburgh and work the market. And there's maybe a younger growing market that's really excited about wine, maybe more into natural wine, small producers, less traditional style wines, but it's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. So you would say maybe more of the classic type regions like Barolo, Barbaresco, Brunello coming into Philly, but then something a little more outside of the box in that Pittsburgh area?
Pittsburgh for sure, yeah.
So maybe a great place also for an emerging winery
yes,
to
definitely.
take. Yeah. So as a state, Pennsylvania is a little complicated, used to have kind of a monopoly type wine buying procedure. So can you break down, does any of that still exist today? And can you break down how a winery can approach Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so, going to Vinitaly and trying to explain to a producer what Pennsylvania is sometimes complicated, but, it's a monopoly state. So there's only really one buyer of wine in the state, and it's Pennsylvania. So even though private distributors operate here, and so me as a restaurant buyer, I'm ordering from, a dozen distributors every week. I place my orders with the reps. They confirm them, but they send the orders into a state portal. And I have to approve and prepay the orders in the state portal. So the state collects the money from the restaurants, and then the state is distributing the money to the distributors. So they're handling all the money and the funds. So they have control, and they're also controlling the markups. So there's no wholesale prices in Pennsylvania. So if you ever visit a restaurant in Pennsylvania and wonder why the wine's more expensive than New York, New Jersey, it's because there's no wholesale pricing. So if I buy one bottle of Prosecco or 100 bottles of Prosecco, it's the same price. And that's really benefiting the state, not necessarily the consumer or the restaurateur or even the distributor. But for the state and the funds it collects, it can actually take care of a lot of things statewide. And for on-premise restaurant, but also the retail environment, there's really no lovely retail wine market in Pennsylvania. Not really. So the state is really in charge of all the stores. And to get wine in a state store, you're presenting wine to bureaucrats in Harrisburg, the capital. But they also have big buying power. So they can buy containers and containers and containers of wine from wineries. So it could really make a small distributor's business and a small winery business if you have the right partners. If they're looking for something particular, they hear the Brunello 2020 vintage is going to be good, and they're trying to get their hands on as much Brunello as possible. It could make a big difference. If they're looking for Prosecco, they could buy 3 containers from a producer. So they have the opportunity to make big buys. It's just how to present wine to the state is a little bit more complicated. And I think knowing the right distributors is probably the key to that.
Yeah. So it sounds very similar to for example, LCBO in Ontario, which a lot of Italian wineries do work with. So maybe they do have some experience with this kind of difficulty or just barrier hoops, I should say. And so you mentioned, though, that there's not necessarily a great retail market. What by that do you mean there's not a lot of variety, or there's not a lot of demand from the consumers?
No, there's definitely demand from the consumer. I would say walking into a state-run store, they're called fine wine and good spirit stores, is not like a lovely experience. I imagine, I know, in San Francisco, LA, you can find these really boutique style stores that are specialized in New York. I have my favorite wine shops that I go when I visit there. That doesn't necessarily happen in Pennsylvania. Recently, they loosened up the laws to allow a particular license, like a grocery store, to start selling some bottles. But again, without the wholesale pricing, it's, the grocery store is buying the wine for the same price that the state's buying it for and then putting a markup on it. So going into these shops, then the wine is just at a price point almost like a restaurant list would be. So then that doesn't make too much sense for a savvy buyer.
Yeah. And I, recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, Pennsylvania really loosened their direct shipping policies. So maybe easier for consumers to get wine that way. But do you foresee maybe any change coming in terms of the retail buying? Any change that, you mentioned it kind of benefits the state. So
yeah, I mean, it's wrapped up in policy and politics. So, all the parts of the government would have to agree to make this big change, and then the public would have to get behind it. And there's a lot of, union employees at the stores. So I think the biggest argument is how to keep these people's jobs. And, like there's so many employees, and then the big revenue number, it's just a big mess that I don't know if they necessarily would want to get into this again, but it's there now, and how to undo it properly is challenging. But having said that, there are better stores than others. Like, being a restaurant, every restaurant has to have what's called a home store that you're aligned to get your spirits from. And sometimes certain wines are only sold into this channel of the state. Like, for example, Sassicaia is a highly allocated wine all over the world. And it makes sense for Sassicaia to sell, let's say the 60 cases they're giving Pennsylvania directly to the state rather than put them with the distributor and have to sell them over the course of the year. So if Sassicaia gets allocated to the state, the only way for me to get Sassicaia is to know when it's going to hit the store I can buy it from and go down to that store and grab it.
Wow.
And then so, the store I go to, there's what's called a wine specialist there, and they'll text me when certain wines come in, like, Sassicaia, Tignanello, Ornellaia, those kind of high-end wines that are popular. And, not only do I want them, but there's probably, retail buyers that want them too. And sometimes the prices can be a little bit competitive compared to, like if people are looking on wine.com or, because you can find those wines on the internet too. But if they end up on the state store shelf, it might be at a slightly better price.
Yeah. And that's nice to know that, they kind of work with you to make sure also that you're getting wines that'll really be of value to your restaurant because you have such a special location.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, people are asking for those wines and looking for them. And, certain stores get better wines, so you can go to a store and find, some of the Brunello producers that we visited, for example, like Lacini Brunello and Chachi Brunello. And, they'll have not just La Marca Prosecco, but there might be another Prosecco that's of a different quality and size production. But it's not every store, and it's not as like lovely, and there might not be the person there to guide you into a nice recommendation. You might have to be a little bit more savvy of a shopper to know what aisle to go down and know what to look for.
Interesting. You kind of mentioned a little bit about Tignanello and Sassicaia and Brunellos, but what styles of Italian wine are doing particularly well in your market?
I think, the fresher, little bit lower alcohol style wines are getting more popular with a younger generation. Maybe people entering the wine market that don't have, the kind of budget to buy
Sassicaias.
And every vintage that comes out, it's more expensive. So, but, less expensive wines, lower intervention wines, organic wine, people are thinking about, like as popular as, people like to go to Whole Foods and are considering what kind of groceries they're buying. They're being also considered about the beverage choices. And I think that falls in line with wine. And so that really resonates with a lot of people. Like when we're talking about wine with the staff and on the floor, we're always talking about the style of farming that producers are considering and what they're doing in the vineyards. And that seems to resonate with guests also, about being very particular and considerate about their choices.
Yeah. And would you say that's guests like across age ranges, not necessarily just younger guests?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're getting a much more distinguished guest at Vetri and the other restaurants, but so I think all of our guests are maybe a little bit more in tune and educated about their choices. But I think people buying wine are also a little bit more educated. Like when they make a step away from a cocktail to try wine, that's, I think, a really important decision.
Yeah, definitely. So can you think of maybe like a particular region of Italy or like a DOC or a DOCG that doesn't really have a strong presence in your market yet, but could do really well?
Well, I'm always particular to Sicily, and I think Sicily in general presents a really good value. And I think in the past 15, 20 years, they've been much more considered about the wines that are coming out of Sicily, the Sicilia DOC, Etna DOC, Cereszuolo, Frappato, Neradavola, Grillo, all those wines present so many really good values and an opportunity for people to try, grapes they never heard of at a really good price point. Under $20 on a shelf is like so easy to like risk that for your dinner that night. And maybe you find something and fall in love with something and go down, a little wine path of like, oh, I love this Sicilian wine. Let me try other Sicilian wine. So I think
Yeah.
more Sicilian wine on the shelves would be, my recommendation.
Okay, listen up, Sicily. All right, let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about discovering and learning about wines. So, of course, as a buyer, it's really your job to know what's out there beyond just what a distributor might bring to you. So, what would you say is the best way for you to discover Italian wines?
For me, I like to go to Italy. So, but not everyone can go to Italy. I think being part of the VIA organization is tremendous. So I think if anybody has any interest in Italian wine and has been working with Italian wine for a while, look into becoming an Italian wine ambassador, taking the VIA course, because not only will you get to meet Italian wine producers, but you get to meet this whole network of great individuals. Like on the wine trip that we went on, there was only one other person that worked in a restaurant like I do. And there was a dozen of us. So the jobs that are available to work in Italian wine are like endless. But to think about wine, discover wine. I'm tasting wine all the time with distributors. I'm going to wine tastings like, I've never been to wine spectator tasting, but Antonio Galloni hosts the Venice Icon tasting in New York. I'm buying an industry ticket for $75. I'm taking the train up there on a Saturday. I'm tasting wine. Like that tasting, I tried back vintages of Ornellaia. I tried Le Macchiole. I met the owners. I met the owners of Castello di Ama. I tried new vintage of Biondisanti. Like, knowing what's happening in your market. I'm also a subscriber to the Galloni site. So, buying next vintage of Sassicaia, I've never tasted it. Biondisanti, I'll check reviews. I'll check ratings, following certain people on social media that are always tasting wine, YouTube videos, Italian wine podcasts, like listening to podcasts, checking YouTube, being curious about wine, drinking wine with dinner, like making thoughtful notes, keeping a journal about wine. All these are really helpful for me.
Yeah, that's a fantastic. And back to VIA, Vinitaly International, it's a great way, obviously, for those of us in the trade to connect with producers, but also a great way for producers to connect with the trade.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's kind of like delivering Italian wine hungry people to them. And I want to talk a little bit, sometimes it's difficult for smaller wineries to have, multiple outlets by which they're reachable, whether it's the website or social media or things like that. But you have a really great story that kind of highlights, I think, the importance of why, no matter how small you are, like make sure that somebody can get in touch with you, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think, a producer doesn't have to have the best website. It's helpful. But, responding to an email, a phone call, or being active on Instagram or social media to have a way for somebody to get in touch with you and being responsive is really important. So the wine that I discovered that I'm still in love with is from Ottaviano Lambruschi from Colli di Luni, Vermentino.
A phenomenal wine, I must say.
Phenomenal wine. And
yeah.
it was actually, before Pennsylvania, they said they had only ever had distribution in California. So
no wonder, because I've had it many times.
You've had it, yeah. It was in that state, and most of it was just sold up and down the coastline of Tuscany and Liguria to the restaurants. So summer 22, I'm in Viareggio. I love this seaside town because it reminds me of the Jersey Shore, but much more glamorous, flat beaches. And we have 4 or 5 days here, and every day at the beach club, we have lunch at the beach club, very organized, civilized. And so I'm on a mission to tasted different Vermentino every day. So Vermentino for lunch, Vermentino for dinner. And the last night we're at this amazing restaurant called Da Romano. It's not on the beach. It's off inland a few, maybe, a few blocks, but they were the first restaurant in Italy to get a Michelin star, and they specialize in seafood. And there's this old world glamour to this place. And so we're ordering Vermentino, and I asked the Som, and he says, if you've never tried Ottaviano Lambrusco, you have to try it. So we tasted it at dinner. Amazing. This is July 22. I'm with my distributor friend, Fred Magnotta, who I used to work for. So Fred's on a mission to find Ottaviano. So he's back in October. He calls on them. They're not really interested in selling any more wine. They're actually out of wine because they're tiny. I think he goes and visits them. There's no wine available. So April 23, I organized a trip with Vetri Soms, a couple of my service captains from Vetri, our buyer from Vegas, our buyer from Fiorella, and we go to Italy. And on the trip, Mark Vetri sponsored our flights. Fred Magnotta paid for the van. We put together this group. We all split the hotel rooms. On this trip, our mission was to stop at Ottaviano Lambrusco and try and convince him to sell some wine to Pennsylvania. So we get there, and the granddaughter's there, and there's no more wine left. We're in April. The wine's sold out. Fabio, the son, arrives, and there's no more wine left. But then Ottaviano gets there, and so we start to have a conversation, and then he invites us up to see the vineyard. So we get in the car, drive up the hill. We see Costa Marina. We see the Vermentino. We talk about the struggles with the past vintage and irrigation and all sorts of stuff. And by the end of that conversation, there was a little bit of wine for Pennsylvania, just a little bit. So somehow found a little bit of wine for Pennsylvania. And that was the start of the relationship with the distributor MPA. I might be a little selfish, but the entire allocation went to Vetri. We put it on by the glass. I got to share the story with everyone in Pennsylvania. And then this year we got the 23. There was more wine available for Pennsylvania. We got the allocation of the 3 crus. Maybe next year we'll get the rosé. So, I think that's a really great example of, being persistent a little bit, but also, I think the best part about wine is the relationships that people can build. So, I think the fact that we all went there was our chance to get the wine here, but also for them to understand and have a trusting partner.
Yeah. They understand that you really value their very precious product because, as we said, they don't make a lot, but they want it to be sold by people that really care about it.
Yeah, for sure.
We just spent a few days together in Montalcino for Benvenuto Brunello, which I'm sure we could talk about that for an entire episode alone. It was such a wonderful opportunity. But can you, from your perspective as a wine buyer, explain why these kind of experiences are important for business development, really along all points of the chain? So definitely, for producers and importers, wholesalers, distributors. But as you mentioned, our wine industry professions were so varied. But from your perspective, why is this important?
Well, I think the exposure to so many producers at Benvenuto Brunello, and also that event was so organized. It was really, really, the consortio did such a great job at organizing it, and there was a lot of people involved in different social media platforms, which I think they understand the value of exposure of a label and a brand and people talking about the wine and the vintage. But for us, visiting producers, tasting Brunello that has never been in Pennsylvania. I think some of the wineries are small, and maybe the wine hasn't even been in New York. A couple of the producers I talked to, their wine wasn't even in New York. So the opportunity for those producers to be exposed and have, distribution in 1 state, 2 states, multiple states, I think is tremendous.
Yeah. And just driving home, again, the point that the wine industry really is a face-to-face business. And, it behooves us to get together, to meet each other, to go see the places where the wine is made. Yeah.
And like them sharing their stories with us sharing their stories with everyone else.
Yeah. Okay. I just have a couple more questions before we start to wrap up. So we've talked a little bit about why it's really important for professionals to continue to learn about wine, but what are some of the ways that you continue to learn about your consumers?
Well, I work the floor, so
first-hand experience.
Talking to guests, is probably the best the best way. I think also going to these different types of wine tastings, like the Venice tasting in New York, other trade tastings that they allow not only trade, but also private
Yeah.
consumers into, you can see what other people are tasting, discovering, enjoying, is a good way.
Yeah, so you're really good at taking in data, on the spot, seeing kind of people's reactions and facial expressions and
Uh, yeah, that's probably. Yeah, I don't really have any other like really close strategy to it, but yeah,
No, I mean
watching,
that's to
yeah,
be
watching
right in front
person,
of them. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, one last question for fun. What would you say right now, because I'm sure your menu changes often, but one of your favorite food and wine pairings currently offered at Vetri?
All right, so there's a pasta dish called Foglio di Olivo. It's a hand rolled dough. It has a pork ragu. So initially we thought, something light, something red, maybe Nebbiolo, maybe Sangiovese, maybe Ettendoc. But when we tasted it, the chefs added it. We got these really beautiful apples in. So they added these Snapdragon apples in at the last minute, and it added an element of freshness. It's not a heavy pork ragu, but it's a really sort of fresh style pork ragu. So somebody in the dining room only wanted white wine with, they're doing the wine pairing, but I only want white wine, whatever. So we pour Soave Classico from Graziano Pra, and they were really, really excited about how it tasted. So that was like, okay, well, let's try it. Like, they tried it even before we tried it.
Yeah.
So the server let me know, this person was really excited about how the Soave tasted with the ragu. So I, hey chef, would you mind making one after service? So we tried it with the Soave, the white wine with the pork ragu, and it was perfect. It was the apple brought everything together.
I love that.
Yeah, Pra Soave 21 Staforte, tremendous wine.
Absolutely. But I love how both of those have like the ragu is a richer, rounder dish with, like you said, this apple freshness. And I even find the pra like a richer, rounder wine, but that like
Yes.
mineral volcanic
Yeah,
freshness.
it's not a heavy wine. It's a rich
Yeah.
wine, but it's still, it's got the salinity, the acidity,
Yes.
the minerality. Yeah. So it cuts through the fattiness of the pork, and then the apple and like the little tropical fruit play off each other nicely.
That's amazing. Now I'm starving and it's 6:30 in the morning in California. Okay, so as we begin to wind down, it's time for our rapid fire quiz. So we ask our guests 3 questions to help our listeners better understand the US market and specifically this episode. So just answer in a couple sentences if you can.
Okay.
But what is your number one tip for mastering marketing to the US wine market?
Don't be afraid to look over the secondary markets like Pennsylvania. Yeah, like some of the smaller states. And I think the smaller states next to the major markets could be the key to help small producers, even big producers.
Yeah, that's a great call out because like you said, you are so close to New York and there's so much competition in New York, but a little bit more open
And usually like
demand.
where the big population densities are, the neighboring states also have big populations too.
Yeah, good to know. What is something you would have told your younger professional self about selling wine in the US?
Don't get discouraged. When I was selling wine, I wasn't a great salesperson because I would get discouraged, and people, you're cold calling, you're knocking on doors. Everybody has good Italian wine in theory, but yeah, being persistent, go back and try and get the sale. Keep persistent, and also do some research and learn about your clients or who you're selling wine to.
Yeah, and I think that helps to be persistent so that when you are knocking on the door, you have authenticity and not just, a sales pitch.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what is your favorite travel hack when doing market work? You said you visit Italy often, so
Don't check your luggage.
oh
Right. Nobody wants to check their
my
luggage.
gosh. Yes. Amen. Here. I'm all for the check bag.
Yeah, Kiara Vasquez told me she's not afraid to wash your clothes in the sink.
Yes,
So
absolutely. Especially, with delays and like lost luggage. There's nothing worse than being without a suitcase for like 3 days. And
right. Yeah.
well, Bobby, thank you so much for your time. It was so fun to see you again after being in Montalcino together. And we're really happy to have you here on Masterclass US Wine Market. So how can our listeners connect with you?
Well, if you're ever in Philadelphia, come visit me at Vetri Cucina. But I'm also on social media, on Instagram. It's just my name, Bobby _ Domenick. Yeah, and if you ever you can slide into my DMs and we can correspond via email or whatever.
Awesome. Oh, and I do want to mention really quickly before we go that Vetri Cucina does do wine dinners that are very well attended, right?
We do wine dinners. So we have this series called Sommelier Series, which myself or some of my other somms will lead wine dedicated classes. So this winter we're doing Vino Alpino wine from the cold Alpine region. So focus on Alto Piemonte, focus on Alto Adige, and they're at our upstairs chef counter. So there's only 10 seats. And then when we have producers in town, we'll do producer dinners.
Great. Yeah. So good opportunity for producers to come visit your restaurant.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. All right, good. I just wanted to call that out, but thank you again so much for joining us. And thanks, I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, me too. All right. Bye.
Bye.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Masterclass US Wine Market. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest industry trends, remember to like, follow, and share our podcast. And if you find value in our conversations, please leave us a review to help others discover the show and grow our community. Stay tuned for new episodes every Monday. Until then, brindiamo il vostro successo.